Last lesson, we talked about the Second Continental Congress. This lesson, I'd like to go a little bit more in depth. Now, the Second Continental Congress assembled in Philadelphia just after the battles of Lexington and Concord, and while Boston was still besieged. The plan had always been for the Continental Congress to assemble in the summer of 1775, unless Parliament acquiesced to the demands. So here it was, 1775, and Congress began to assemble. In the First Continental Congress, Georgia had been absent. In the Second Continental Congress, Georgia arrived, but they arrived late. Also, Canada and the Caribbean were invited again, but they didn't come either. Parliament had, in fact, not only repudiated the demands from 1774, they had also made what was called a conciliatory resolution in January 1775. This resolution stated that any colony that contributed to the general defense of the British Empire would have its taxes removed. They had done this in an attempt to separate the 13 colonies. However, all 13 colonies refused the conciliatory resolution, and in fact, the only colony that agreed was Nova Scotia, which did have their taxes removed. By the time Congress assembled, it became clear, after Lexington and Concord and Boston, that they were going to have to take control of the army, which they did right away. But it was also clear that Congress did not have a constitution that gave them the permission to do this. Now, if we think about this a little bit more carefully, we see a problem. All 13 colonies had been created by Act of Parliament or Act of the King of England. None of them existed on their own rights. Legally, they only existed because of Britain. And they had never been given permission to create a legislative body over them. There was already a legislative body over them, Parliament or the King. They had never been given permission to create a Congress. And yet here they were, creating a Congress. It was outside of law, or what we call extra-legal. But that's what happens with a revolution. The party that's revolting is at first extra-legal and comes to justify itself through its military might. They would eventually create, in addition to the army, a navy as well, which was critical at that time. Boston was besieged, you'll recall, supported by the British Navy. The Continental Navy was created in October of 1775, and its primary goal was to disrupt British supply lines, which it accomplished. In fact, by the time Washington had taken control of the army at Boston, he had already begun to acquire several vessels with the intention of disrupting supplies and stealing gunpowder. He had even purchased a ship out of his own funds for this exact reason. In December of 1775, Congress commissioned 13 frigates, one for each colony, and of these, 8 were built. All 8 were destroyed or captured in the next few years, but they did accomplish their goal. They were outmatched at sea, but they disrupted British lines. Congress also began to work immediately on currency. You'll recall that there were a couple different kinds of currency in the colonies at this time. There was silver specie, which were actual silver coins minted by Spain. These were the most reliable. There were also British pounds, which were somewhat reliable as well, except that now we were at war with the British. Was that pound still worth money? And then there were still continental pounds as well. Pennsylvania might have a pound, Virginia might have a pound, and these varied in reliability and strength. Congress realized it needed its own money, and so it created the Continental dollar. Now, over time, Congress would end up creating too many of these dollars, and they depreciated in value. And also, the British began counterfeiting the bills, further depreciating them. By the end of the war, the bills were far too common, and effectively the Continental dollar was valueless. Many soldiers went without pay, and when they did get paid in Continental dollars, it didn't amount to much at all. They would eventually have to return home and work. Continental Congress also began to work on diplomacy in July 1775. They created a declaration of causes, outlining why it was necessary to take up arms against Britain. This included taxation without representation, the Intolerable Acts, and Parliament's declaration that it had absolute sovereignty over the colonies. They also sent what was called the Olive Branch Petition, another attempt at peace. However, this petition was received poorly in London. Parliament declared all the colonies were in rebellion in August of 1775. To further their efforts at diplomacy, they also sent Silas Deane to France, and his intention was to bring France into the war. He was able to get both the French and the Spanish to begin secretly supplying munitions to America, and that was extremely important. And they also agreed to support some attacks on England. He recruited several European nobles to the military cause as well. And this is very important because these military nobles had military training, which the Americans lacked. It included people like the Marquis de Lafayette, Casimir Pulaski, and Baron von Steuben. Silas Deane was later replaced by Benjamin Franklin and Arthur Lee, who continued negotiations with both Spain and the Netherlands. It became clear, however, that before a foreign nation could be officially involved in the American Revolution, the colonists would need to declare their independence and to be recognized as an independent nation. My main point in this lesson has been to study the Second Continental Congress and realize that it presided over America until the new Constitution of 1787. But it did so without legal right, but simply by the will of the American people.